Today's daf is daf Pei Hey, and the daf begins with the shita of Rabbi Zera about the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim. And Rabbi Zera says that the machlokas, in the case where you wrote a Tanai of Almanas in the get, and whether the get is kosher or apostle, only applies if the Almanas, the Tanai, was written in the Gufo shall get before the Torah. Because then it means that when the Torah, the main part of the get, was written, it was written al das this Tanai. And in a case where li'achar Torah, if the Tanai was written after the Torah, that's the first three words on our daf, l'divrei kol kosher, means even Rebbe would agree to the Chachamim that the get is kosher. Rebbe's chumrah, in a case where he wrote the almanas in the gufo shall get, only applies according to Zera if the Tanai was written before the Torah, then it becomes part of what the Eidim are signing. And Rebbe, in such a case, even though a Tanai is valid, but he says we're always afraid that if he adds a Tanai, he might say chutz. So that's called gazrinon chutz. Almanas atu chutz. Almanas atu chutz. But again, in the case where the Tanai was written after the Torah, then even Rebbe would agree that the get is kosher. So the Gemara says the following: Masnisin de Katonik Savo, the Mishnah which says that if you wrote the Tanai inside the get is possible. Vokimna, and we interpreted it way back on Daf Pei Beis that bechutz, that it's a case where he said aval, and we interpret aval as chutz, so there was a sheer beget. Aval almanas, lo pasil. In the case of almanas, everybody agrees that if it was after the Torah, almanas is not like chutz, and therefore the get is kosher. Iboy saying another possibility is that lifnei Torah, that if he writes the Tanai before the Torah, and then the Mishnah would allow for the get to be kosher in the case of Tanai, that's Rabbanon, because the Rabbanon never accepted, according to Zera, the Gzera of Almanas Atu Chutz. And this is against Rebbe, because Rebbe's shita is Gazrinan Almanas Atu Chutz. And therefore, even though the Tanai itself was not Chutz, and it was a valid language of Tanai, nevertheless, the get is going to be possible because of Gzera Atu Chutz. The Boisema, another possibility is that the Mishnah is talking about a case where he wrote the Tanai Liachar Torah, for Divrei Kol. Then according to Zera, everybody agrees, even Rebbe concedes that the get is kosher because the Almanas was written after the Torah. Now, keep in mind, had he written chutz after the Torah, then the get would be possible. And we usually, according to Rebbe's shita, have a gzera of Almanas otu chutz. But if it's after the Torah, then you have, says Tosfos, what you call a gzera l'gzera. You're piling up one gzera on the top of another gzera. Why? Because since it's liachar Torah, then even in the case of chutz, that's only gzera atu kodem Torah, because what's written after the Torah does not indicate the das of the Eidim when they signed the get. And now on top of that, you're going to tell me that not only do I have a gzera in a case of chutz of liachar Torah atu lifnei Torah, but on top of it, you can have another gzera of almanas atu chutz. So ein gozrin gzera l'gzera. So all this is according to Rabbi Zera. Now we go on to the dissenting view of Rav. Rav Amar machlokes achar Torah. Rebbe shita l'chumra, to passel the get, is going to apply even if the Tanai was written after the Torah. Which means that according to Rava, Rebbe is going to pile one gzera on top of the other. The Rebbe Sover, Gazrinon, we're going to make a gzera of liachar Torah or to lifnei Torah. So not only do we have the gzera of almanas otu chutz, but on top of that, we have a gzera of lifnei hatoref of otu liachar hatoref, of liachar hatoref otu lifnei hatoref. For Rabbanan Savri lo gazrinon otu lifnei hatoref. When he writes it tonight after the Torah, we don't have a gzera otu lifnei hatoref. And as we said before, that would be gzera l'gzera. Aval lifnei hatoref, according to Rav Shita, l'divrei hakol posel. The single gzera of Tanai, meaning almanas, otu chutz, that even the Rabbanan accepted, according to Rava. And that's lifnei hatoref. It's only the achar hatoref. If the Rabbanan argue that you're adding and piling one gzera on top of the other. Masnisan the Ketoni Ksavo, the Mishnah which says that if he wrote chutz in the gufo shall get, meaning before the Torah, vokimna, we interpret it bechutz, that when he says Ella, he means chutz. Aval almanas lo posel. If it's liachar toref, then everybody agrees, even Rebbe, that it's not a psul, because now you're piling up one gzera on top of the other. And then we're going to say that according to Rava, Rebbe holds that if you wrote a t'nai in the get, then what we would have considered to be a gzera l'gzera, because he wrote the t'nai after the Torah, so you have a gzera to kodem ha-Torah, and another gzera of almanas atu chutz. That's the sheet of Rebbe. And the Chachamim hold no, that since he wrote the t'nai li'achar toref, that would be gzera l'gzera, and therefore the get is kosher. Tani avu de Rabbi Ovin kamei de Rabbi Zera. If the Baal writes kosav get al t'nai, divrei hakol posel. So when Rabbi Ovin, avu de Rabbi Ovin, said this in front of Rabbi Zera had a problem with this, and he said v'miflag pligi, the Chachamim were machshir get with t'nai, and even Rebbe was only posel a get with t'nai if it was written before the Torah. So how can you make this blanket, all-inclusive statement that everybody agrees that a get that has a t'nai in it is posel? Even Rebbe, who is machmir, that's only if the t'nai was written before the Torah. So what's this divrei hakol business? And therefore, Abzera says to Avud Rabbi Oven ala Ema, maybe what you heard in the transmission got a little bit confused, but it should be Ema l'divrei hakol kosher. Not l'divrei hakol posel, but we're talking about liachar Torah. And liachar Torah, according to the logic of Rabbi Zera, everybody, even Rebbe, agrees that the get is kosher. So the language here should be divrei hakol kosher v'echidom liachar Torah. So the Gemara asks for lema harei zeh posel. If Rebbe is trying to change the transmission of Tani Avud Rabbi Oven, he didn't have to go so far as to change the word posel to kosher. He could have just said harei zeh posel. And how would we interpret this brisa if it said harei zeh posel? Rebbe. It reflects the shita of Rebbe. It's not divrei hakol, but it's harei zeh posel. And we're talking about a case where the Tanai was written before the Torah. So where it says Tana divrei hakol asnei, he says that there was no question about the fact that the words divrei hakol was certainly part of the transmission and the nusach of this brisa. Why? Because although kosher b'psul michlefle, sometimes a person might make a mistake and he hears kosher and he thinks it's possible, or the other way around. But harei zeh b'divrei hakol lo michlefle. A person would never transmit something in error and say divrei hakol, because divrei hakol has a very important input. It means that we paskin like that. So we don't assume that there's any michlefa, there's any kind of mistaken transmission from harei zeh posel to divrei hakol posel. And therefore Rabbi Zera had to accept the nusach of divrei hakol, his only possible fallback position to justify this brisa, therefore would be to cross out the word posel and fill in the word kosher. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Pei He. Now, we already learned in the Mishnah back on Pei Beis that if a man says, Harei at muteres l'chol chutz miploni, according to Chacham, the get is possible. And now the Mishnah wants to understand, when do we apply the principle of shir? If he says, Harei at muteres l'chol ella li aba ulavich lachi ulachich li eved ulioved kochamim ulchol mishein olav kiddushin kosher. There's no problem of chutz in cases where the Baal, when he's megarish his wife, he says chutz from someone who she doesn't have tfisas kiddushin with anyway, whether it's his father, her father, his brother, her brother, an eved or a guy. And then the Mishnah has a general rule called Misha Enel of Kiddushin. So what's the underlying lumdus here? Shir haposel beget. Why is shir posel beget? Because he leaves ishus and there's no creases. And that ishus reflects itself in generating a new iser. So if he says a t'nai of chutz, and because of that t'nai of chutz, he prevents her from having a relationship of marriage with whoever is mentioned in the chutz, that's called shir beget, because he's obviously holding on to the ishus. And as a result of the mixas ishus that still remains after the get, she is not allowed to have her marriage relationship with so-and-so. But if she couldn't have a relationship with so-and-so, regardless of the chutz, meaning the t'nai itself is not the gorem, it's not what's causing the impossibility of her marriage to so-and-so, because irrelevant to the chutz and the t'nai, it would be impossible for her to be married to so-and-so, whether it's an erva or it's an eved or an akel. There's no tfisas kiddushin for a Jewish girl with an eved v'akel. However, what is shir beget? It's a case of chayve lavin. Harei muteres l'chol adam ella almona l'kohen gadol. You will not be allowed to marry a kohen gadol if you're an almona. Now that's a very strange halacha, because he's giving her a get. So in any event, she's a grusha. And then the next line in the Mishnah says, grusha v'chalutz l'kohen hedjot. I mean, she's a grusha by definition. So when he says chutz mi l'kohen hedjot, then what exactly is he adding here with this t'nai? Because even had he not added chutz l'kohen hedjot, she would not be allowed to marry kohen hedjot, because insofar as she's a grusha. So in the notes here, he applies the principle of agav shigras haloshon. And in fact, she's a grusha because of the get, and she cannot marry any kohen, let alone a kohen gadol. And the Mishnah is telling me a chiddush that this is called a shir, even if she was an almana before he married her and before the get, and now he has two isurim to a kohen gadol, and grusha l'kohen hedjot is just a shigur de lashon agav almana l'kohen gadol. So the main isur here is that she cannot marry an almana l'kohen gadol. Now, keep in mind, she couldn't marry an almana l'kohen gadol in any event, because she's an almana, and a kohen gadol has to marry a besula. However, what kind of isur would it be? In the case of an almana l'kohen gadol, it might be an isur, call it an isur lav, but nothing worse. But now he's saying it's an isur eshes ish, because he's leaving over some of his ishus. And as a result, he's being mafkia the marriage itself, and that's called shir beget, or mamzer sunesinul Yisrael, or bas Yisrael, or mamzer ulenosin. Right? All of these cases of chutz are creating an isur v'eshes ish, where beforehand it was only an isur lav, and kol misheyesh lav kiddushin, there would be tfisas kiddushin afilu ba'avera. But the Kedushin would be Tofes if he married her. Let's say she was not married and she was a Pnuya. In any of these Isurim, the Kedushin would be Tofes, despite the fact that she violated an affair by marrying him. But now, the Kedushin can't be Tofes because he's setting up a shear in the get, Pasul, therefore the get is Pasul. The Gemara says, Klola de Reisha, in the Reisha, the Mishnah, it says, L'chol Misha Ein Aleha all of Kedushin, is Lasuye Mai. What is it coming to add? Shar Chayve Krisus. Because we have a principle that Ein Kedushin Tofsim B'Chayve Krisus. So that even though the Mishnah mentioned a more severe Isur, like for example, Abba Avicha, etc., where it's the most severe erva with a capital punishment, but what about Chayve Krisus? And that's included in the klal, the ribui of Kol Mishain Aleh Kedush. Klal de Seifa, Lasuye. What is the Seifa when it says Kol Mishayesh Aleh Kedushin Afilu Baver? What's coming to include? Shar Chayve Lav. Other Chayve Lav. Now here there's a girsa that actually enumerates Shar Chayve Lav as Amoni Moravi Nesini Mitzri Vadomi. Okay, so there's a long discussion about the Isur Nesina, and we've talked about that in Masechet Ksubis, so we're not going to go over that now. Now, in the case of Amoni Moavi, those are Isurei Lav, but Mitzri Vadomi is only Ador Shlishi, and that's an Isur Aseh. So it makes a lot of sense to justify the Girsa of Mitzri Vadomi. I'm not sure. But the Gemara says Shar Chayve Lav, so it makes sense that it's referring to Amoni Moavi. But there's a bigger Chiddush in Mitzri and Adomi, because that's only an Isur Aseh. Now we have a bunch of Sfeikus, all of which will end up as Teku. And Rav asks Rav Nachman the following: a man divorced his wife. He says, you will not be allowed to marry to a katan. Now, she can't marry a katan regardless of the get. I mean, of the shir and the get of chutz. She can't have kedushin with a katan. A katan doesn't have das. He cannot be mekadosh and she has no das konen. And therefore, this is not a shir, because irregardless of the get, she couldn't have a tfisas kedusha with a katan. No, dilma, should we say asi lechlal havaya? That a katan will eventually, when he grows older, become a gadol. He will be included in kedushin, and he can create an ishus. And now, what the Baal is saying is that even with regard to this katan, you will never, ever be able to have tfisas kedusha because there's a shir in the get. Amalei, Rav Nachman responded to Rava, to Nisua. We learned in a brayso, Ketana miskareshes b'kedusha aviyah. If a father marries off his daughter when she's a ketana, and the kedushin is tofes doraisa, now he dies, then she can accept the get. This I don't understand. I wrote myself a note here because l'chorah she's a mashalcha v'yena chozeres. I guess we're talking about a ketana who's a little bit older and more mature, so she understands what a get is about. Anyway, Rav Nachman says the following: Amai, how could she accept a get? We have an open-ended gzeira shava to equate kiddushin and gerushin based on the pasuk in Kitetse v'yotzav ha'hoisa lishachar. And therefore, Ketana should not be able to be Mekadesh herself. I'm sorry, since a Ketana cannot be Mekadesh herself, she cannot be Megarish herself. She cannot receive her Gerish. So why is this a case of a woman whose Yecholol is Garish? It says here, Ketana Miskareshes, and the answer is Ella Asil Chalavaya. The only possible logical way of explaining and justifying this halacha is to say, because although she's a ketana now and she's not capable of kiddushin, she will be capable of kiddushin and she will have a das kona, das machna, I should say, when she becomes a gedola. So that's called asil lichlal. Is hachanami. Let's apply the same thing here in the case of a katan. Asil lichlal avaya. When he becomes a gadol, he can be mekadosh and isha, and therefore, even within the context of an impossibility of tfisas kedushin in the current present situation of a katan, but nevertheless, the katan is asi lichlal havaya. And this reminds me, by sheer association, of Tosfos' discussion in the Sugya and Ksubas on Daf Tes, I believe, of Ger Katan, that we can be Megayer a Ger Katan al Das Bezdin, and Tosfos asks, wait a minute, there's no such thing as a Chiyah for a Katan. And Tosfos answers, it's not like Schiyah to an Akum is Mufka from Schiyah, but a Katan is Asi Lichlal Zechiyah. So we're considering this katan a gavra ishus. Why? Because now, although he cannot implement kedushin, he will be able to implement kedushin. So he's included under ishus. He's a gavra ishus. Now the Gemara continues with another question that Rava raised to Rav Nachman. Chutz min hanolad. You will not be able to marry anyone who does not live today and will be born tomorrow. Ma, what's the din? Hashta mi'al lo isyal. Right now, there's no possibility of issues. There's not a shir beget. Irregardless of his tanai, she cannot marry someone who's not born. O dilma aside dimisyalde. There are people that we know will be born, and she'll become asura on all these people for kedushin because of the shir beget, and therefore the get is possible. He didn't shir. Amalei Rav Nachman responded to Rava to nisua. I can derive an answer to your question from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if he says chutz mi ashali eved uli oved kochavim, the get is kosher, and that's not considered shir because there's no tfisas kedushin neither with an eved or with an akum. Im isa, why did the Mishnah skip a step over here? The Mishnah should have said lois what's called chutz min hanoladim. And let's be medayik from the Mishnah. Eved v'yovik nami avidu the megayer, even though they could be misgayer, and then it would be included in issues. So the get now will be, the chutz of the get will now be meaningful to make it impossible to marry the eved of the akum after gerus. And yet, the Mishnah says the get is kosher and it's not shir beget. And why isn't it shir beget? Because we're not going to apply the principle of avidi de migayre yisofenami here too. Hanach lavli gure kaime, hani disyaldi kaime. Only those who are alive and are subject to marriage, then the chutz is a shir. But those who haven't yet been born, even though they're omed livaled, then it should be. No, I'm sorry. I connected the kash of the Gemara, the Raya of Rav Nachman, together with the rejection of this. Forgot to underline two words. Yeah. So again, let's go through the logic, the Shakla V'Tarya. Rav Nachman said to Rava, in the case of Eved and Ove Kochavim, we don't apply the principle of Avidi de Megairi, and we're going to call it a get kosher, and it's not shir, because right now the Eved or the Akum are not included in Tfisas Kedusha because there's no Geras. And if we apply the same logic to the case of Noladim, Hashta Mi'alo Usyalim. So that's not considered a shir because he's not preventing her from having issues with anyone who's alive. And the Gemara rejects it. No. In the case of an Eved V'Yakum, the reason why there's no shir in the get is kosher is because they're not Omed L'Sgayet. We don't assume that a guy is going to become a Jew. What's the percentage point? Although in the case of Eved, it's a little bit more confusing to me because there the Shichur will make him into a ger, and he'll have Tfisas Kedushin after Shichur. But Hani L'Siyuli Kaime, we know that the non-born, the not yet born, are going to become born. So therefore, that's considered a shir. Next question of Rav. Chutz mi bala chosa. You cannot marry the husband of your sister. What's the din? The pasuk says, "Vayikra Yudches, v'isha el achosa lo sikach litzror legalos ervaso lebechayeh." A person is not allowed to marry achos ishta as long as his wife is alive, and even after he divorces his wife, he's not allowed to marry her sister. But after his wife dies, then he can marry her sister. So if a man says, Chutz mi bala chosa, what's the din? Hashta mi eslo chazila. Right now, the sister of the woman is alive, and as far as the Megarish is concerned, he can't marry that sister, so that's not shir, and there's no tefisas kedusha, it's chayv increased. O dilma zimnin de mesa chosa v'chazile. Since one of the two sisters might die, and then he's allowed to marry her, so now there's a shir beget because he's saying that she won't be able to get married to that person who's married to her sister, even though that sister might die. It's possible that Megayer, and yet we say we're not choshesh for that, and it's not a shir beget, and the get is kosher here too. We don't have to be choshesh for the death of the sister. Mariette says, no, that's no proof at all. Geirus lo shchicha, but misa shchicha. We don't assume gerus, as we said before. What's the statistical possibility of gerus? But in the case of misa, misa is part of life. The Baal says to his wife, take this get chutz mi znusech. Now he's allowing to marry her to anyone in the world, but she's not allowed to have znus, mouth. This would seem to be a shir. V'nisuin holo shir. Maybe shir is only if he makes it impossible for her to get married. O dilma shir b'biyah. That the reason why she can't have biyah now is because of the ishus that he's leaving intact. And in my mind, the second side is much more powerful. Amalei Rav Nachman says to Rav Tanisua, the Mishnah says that li avich, that's not considered a shir to get his kosher ubimai. And what's the case? Ilem, if he says to her b'nisuin is avich b'nei nisuin, why would he say that you can't marry my father, your father, because there's no possibility of marriage in any event? The Torah doesn't recognize such a marriage. He must be saying to her that I'm imposing upon you an isur's nus. And in the cases of these harayas, that isur's nus exists independent of his shir, of his tanai, and therefore it's not shir. But let's be medaik from the Mishnah that when he says chutz mi znusayich li abol avicho delo shir haliacher shir, this would be shir beget for anyone with whom she could have his nus, except to be an Isur Lav, perhaps, of Kadesha, and the Gemara rejects it. Dilma, perhaps, B'nisuin, Tiavid V'intzava. Maybe he's saying, look, I don't want you to marry this, my father, your father, this person, even though there's no Tfisas Kedushin, but nevertheless he was thinking that maybe she would violate the Isur Kedushin and get married to him, and therefore he made a shir. And in this case, we're saying that it's not a shir. But there's no proof from here that chutz mizunusayach would be considered a shir. Another question: what happens if he says chutz mi shelo kedarka? You cannot have a bia shelo kedarka mal v'kedarka holo shir. The get is complete, creases as far as a regular bia, and therefore we should not consider this as a shir. The Gemara Kiddushin Chav Beis derives from Bishkevei Isha, pasuk in Vayikra Yudches, an exact equation, a total equation between Bia Kedarka and Bia Shelo Kedarka for all dinim. So if he's Mishayer Ba Bia Shelo Kedarka, that's considered a shir, and the get is possible. Another question: I want to retain for myself this chus, even after I divorce you, of being mefer your nidarim. Ma, what's the din? B'nesuin lo kashir. He's allowing her to marry any other man. O dilma isha yikimenu v'isha yiferenu ksiv. It means that the ability to be mefer nidarim is rooted in the ishus and generated by the ishus, and therefore the word isha indicates that if he's not going to allow to be free of Hafaras Nedarim, he's going to retain for himself the schus to be made for Nedarim. That means Isha, that she's still considered his husband, and therefore he's being Meshayar in the Ishus, and the get is possible. Another suffix. Meaning, if you get married to a Kohen, you won't be able to eat Truma. You'll still be considered Kanui to me, and I'm not a Kohen, but a Yisrael, and therefore you cannot eat Truma. Mao, B'nesuin lo kashir. He didn't prevent her from getting married to anyone. O Dilma, maybe we should say Kinyan Kaspo Ksiv. The ability of a woman, if she marries a Kohen, the heter to eat Truma is based on the pasuk Vayikra Chav Beis Kinyan Kaspo, meaning Ishus. And if the second Baal, who's a Kohen, cannot be Machal of the Truma, it means that she's not considered Kinyan Kaspo because the Baal, or Rishon, was Meshayar B'Kedushin, and therefore the get is possible. Another suffix: you will not be with your death bequeath your possessions to your second husband. I will inherit you after your death. Ma'u b'nesuin lo kashir o dilma l'she'ero v'yorash osoksiv. Pasuk in Bamidbar Chav Tes Chav Zayin in Parshas Pinchas. And the Torah says that you inherit ishto, osa, and that's called she'ero. She'ero is ishto. It's a reflection of the ishus. It's one of those monetary laws that are rooted in the ishus. And now if he's saying, I will continue despite the get to inherit your property after you die, then he's saying that my ishus with you is still connected, and therefore it's a sheer beget. He didn't do an absolute krisus, and the get is possible. Another song. A man says to his wife, you could be Mekadosh to everyone through Kesef or Bia, but not through Shtar. He did allow her through this get to get married to someone else, as long as they don't use the operative method of Shtar, but rather Bekesef or Bia. And therefore, there's no shear, and the get is kosher. Oh, Dilma, shall we say, in that very pasuk of the Yotzav Haisa, we have not only a hekesh equating Kiddushin and Gerushin, but we also have a hekesh equating all the forms of Havayos, all three Kinyone, Kiddushin, Kesef, Shtar, Bia. And if there's a shear in one of the three Havayos, it's as if there was a shear in all the Havayos, and therefore the get is possible. It's a shear beget. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Pehei and Aleph, Gufo shall get. Now this Mishnah is going to analyze the exact text of the get. And the ikar of the get is Harei at Muteres l'chol Adam.